Hey, this is Adriano Peta from Geopolitica Mundial channel, and today's video. We're going to look at something that isn't exactly geopolitics, it's not strictly geopolitics, but it's something that's affecting geopolitics because it's impacting the most fundamental, the most basic part of the constitution of societies, which, as a result, form civilizations and consequently the geopolitical structure, and that is the family. We have seen in recent decades systematic attacks, whether for ideological or economic reasons, on the family. And the result explains a large part of this global chaos that we are seeing nowadays, especially this chaos that is even greater in the West, which includes not only the traditional West, but also Latin America and Brazil. We'll discuss this in more detail here, okay? Before that, don't forget to subscribe. Share this video with everyone you know, because by sharing, you have no idea how much support you are giving. If YouTube relied on recommending this video, no one would know about the Geopolitica Mundial channel since it gets buried online. Sharing really helps, so thank you. Again, my name is Adriano Peta and this is the Geopolitica Mundial channel. In the last 5 decades, Western countries have witnessed major changes in their family structure, including a significant increase in households without a father present, partly because of a culture that is increasingly hostile to masculinity. And that's where we have studies indicating that children raised in homes with both parents obviously tend to have better outcomes in various areas than children raised in homes with only mothers or only fathers. For example, children who grow up with both parents, on average, show higher academic performance, fewer behavioral problems, and better indicators of psychological well-being. But, on the other hand, children raised only by their mother or only by their father have higher risks of poor academic performance, impaired social and emotional development, worse health outcomes, and less success in the job market. And according to a broad review of studies, growing up in a single-parent family is linked, at the very least, to lower educational attainment, a higher likelihood of teenage pregnancy, worse health, and greater dependence on public assistance. Now, just to make this clear, this is a probability and not a prophecy, because not all children from single-parent households have negative outcomes. The average advantage of two-parent families, that is, those with both a father and a mother, remains strong even after taking into account factors like family income and parents' education level. An analysis in the United States proved that the presence of two parents continues to be associated with better educational outcomes and less substance use, and that these differences are not fully explained by income or parenting style. In other words, beyond the economic benefits, after all, both the father and the mother contribute income and time. Where two adults share the responsibility of supervising and supporting the children, the two-parent structure itself tends to provide greater stability and supervision for the children. But of course, conflicts between the parents can undermine these benefits. Children who are exposed to high levels of family conflict show worse indicators of well-being. But even when compared to two-parent households with high conflict or with step-parents, they often show the same or worse outcomes in children's educational achievement and behavior. Now there's a catch, and it's one of those that feels like a punch in the gut. The question is whether children raised only by their father would do better or worse than those raised only by their mother. And in socioeconomic terms, father-only families tend to have a higher average income and a lower incidence of poverty than mother-only single-parent families. But despite the better economic position, research has shown that children under the sole custody of the father may be more likely to use drugs and have more school problems than those living only with the mother. And of course, more than families with both a father and a mother, which again are the ideal model. In the same way, children in single-father households showed more behavioral problems and a slight deficit in cognitive skills compared to those children raised only by single mothers. In adulthood, those who grew up only with their biological father tended to complete, on average, half a year less of schooling than those raised only by their mother. It is suggested that single mothers generally get more involved in the daily routines and care of their children, participating in school activities, knowing their friends, monitoring their health, while fathers in general may have more difficulties with these everyday tasks. And indeed, a study found that single mothers tend to be more attentive and present in their children's daily lives than single fathers, which could influence children's behavior and performance. On the other hand, other analyses highlight that single-father households often avoid the extreme poverty conditions that affect single-mother households and may be able to offer more material benefits. So if we compare maternal single parenthood with paternal single parenthood, there are trade-offs involving financial resources versus daily involvement. Single fathers have more resources on average, but single mothers usually provide greater daily supervision. But again, research shows that neither type of single-parent household achieves the same average outcomes as households with both parents present. The problem behind this is that, from the second half of the 20th century onwards, what we saw were both formal government policies and informal pressure from radical groups that pushed for illegal socio-cultural changes which directly affected the family structure in Western countries. Several public policies ended up minimizing the role of the father or treating his presence as simply optional. A notorious example is the design of social assistance programs in the United States, but which were copied in other countries in Europe and Latin America, including Brazil, which historically give government benefits only to single mothers with children, excluding single fathers because they are considered able to work, as well as families with both parents. In practice, this meant that mothers who got married or lived with the father of their children could even lose benefits, creating an economic disincentive to marriage. And studies throughout the 1990s were already able to detect the impacts of this. When most of the more recent research concluded that social programs had a mathematically negative effect on marriage rates and a mathematically positive effect on out-of-wedlock birth rates, which contributed to the increase in single parenthood. In other words, policies that provided financial support exclusively to fatherless households ended up encouraging arrangements without the father. In addition to that, the adoption of no-fault divorce culture in several Western countries in the late 1960s and 70s made it easier to dissolve marriages, increasing divorce rates and often leaving mothers as the primary guardians of the children. In the field of cultural narratives, the last few decades have also brought changes in values that, in some cases, have downplayed the importance of the father. After all, sectors of left-wing social movements advocated for female autonomy and the right of mothers to raise their children alone, challenging traditional family models as if they were a form of oppression. In certain discourses, it was even argued that the father was unnecessary for the healthy development of the child, as long as there was a stable maternal figure or support from the community, which obviously was a fiction. In 1996, the sociologist David Popenow warned about an erosion of fatherhood in the United States, something that was replicated in other countries. Noting that fathers were more distant from family life than ever before, while a modern line of thought considered fathers to be dispensable figures, sometimes even obsolete. And in fact, at the turn of the 21st century, it became relatively common in Western popular culture to portray single, independent mothers, in an excessively positive way, to the point of either minimizing the father's role or even suggesting that fathers were getting in the way. And that's still assuming that other sources like the government, schools, stepfathers, or grandparents could fulfill their roles. In other words, pop culture portrayed fathers as something completely replaceable or even as an obstacle. And this came along with academic and media narratives about so-called toxic masculinity, which really took off, criticizing traditional models of masculinity and, in some cases, devaluing classic paternal attributes such as firm discipline or family leadership, saying that these figures, more than just unnecessary, were a bad influence on children. And this, combined with an explosion of ill-intentioned teachers who put themselves in the role of fathers or mothers as if they could supplement the absence of parents. And although a good part of these narratives aim to promote gender equality or protect children from abusive father figures, it's like that old saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And honestly, I even doubt that in most cases we were talking about people with good intentions. because the possible real effect of this was the decrease in paternal engagement, with young men feeling less motivated to take on the role of father or feeling marginalized in the family context and avoiding starting families. It's important to note that policies and narratives vary between Western countries. For example, in some European nations that have adopted generous parental leave and incentives for fathers to participate in child rearing, the trend of disengagement has been partially reduced. Whereas in others, such as the United States, which Brazil takes as a model, the focus has been on policies enforcing child support from absent fathers, emphasizing their financial contribution but not necessarily promoting their active emotional involvement. And it goes even further because in Brazil, it's not uncommon for female lawyers to advise women to prepare to scam their husbands beforehand, which in practice is resulting in a wave of men who are running away from their traditional role in forming families. The role of the government and public authorities, including the judiciary, who openly antagonize men, combined with these female lawyers, is the greatest contraceptive ever recorded in the history of humanity. And the undeniable and empirically proven fact is that the rise of single-parent families, especially those led by mothers, is linked to negative social effects in various dimensions. There is no shortage of studies confirming a strong correlation between the absence of fathers and young people's involvement in crime. In community analyses in the United States, the proportion of fatherless households has proven to be one of the most powerful predictors of future violent crime rates. Communities with a high prevalence of fatherless families can have juvenile crime rates up to 85% higher than those in communities where most families have both fathers and mothers. And this effect is not limited to one gender. Maternal absence has been linked to violence committed by both boys and girls, with no significant differences between them. In other words, family structure has emerged as a critical factor in the social fabric, affecting the capacity for supervision and informal control that can prevent violent behaviors. At the individual level, most of the data points in the same direction. A survey indicated that 70% of incarcerated adolescents did not have a father at home and were generally raised only by their mother. And even more strongly, researchers concluded that the best predictor of incarceration in adult life is having been raised by a single parent. But again, and just to make it very clear and reaffirmed, this does not mean that single parenthood will directly cause crime, but it shows a statistical link. That is, it's not an inevitable prophecy, but a probability. Studies that follow children for decades reinforce this observation. For example, an analysis of young Americans born in the United States in 1980 found that men who grew up without a biological father at home, they were about twice as likely to have been arrested before the age of 30 compared to their peers from traditional families with both a father and mother. And even after controlling for factors such as family income, mother's education, race, and initial cognitive performance, the absence of a father remained associated with high crime rates. Communities with many homes lacking a father figure tend to suffer from less informal social control because there are fewer adult males available to supervise groups of teenagers in public spaces, less participation of fathers in community organizations, and weaker support networks. And according to the theory of collective efficacy, neighborhoods with high rates of family breakdown have more difficulty enforcing norms and supervising young people, which results in higher delinquency. Traditionally, involved fathers tend to contribute to stricter rules and closer monitoring of their children. After all, they want to know where their kids are, who they're hanging out with, and so on, which helps protect against getting involved in crime. Especially for boys, having a good relationship with their father has proven to be even more protective against delinquent behavior than having a good relationship with their mother. These findings confirm the idea that the father often acts as a disciplinarian and role model, and when this figure is missing, many boys become more vulnerable to getting involved in risky activities or falling under the influence of bad groups. The scientific literature also documents strong impacts of the presence or absence of fathers on children's educational outcomes and their future economic mobility. That's because children from families with both a father and a mother on average get higher grades and stay in school longer than children from single-parent families, even after controlling for basic characteristics. The studies by sociologist Sarah McClanahan e veja bem, ela é de esquerda, o que evita uma acusação de ser um estupro, showed that growing up without one of the parents is associated with an increased likelihood of repeating a grade and dropping out of school. And statistics from educational associations indicate that about 71% of all students who dropped out of high school in the United States come from homes where the father was not present. The father's influence also manifests itself in intergenerational economic advancement, that is, in the ability of children from poor families to move up economically in adulthood. An extensive study led by economist Raj Shetty examined data from millions of individuals and found that regions with a higher proportion of single-parent households have lower social mobility, much lower for low-income children. In fact, the community factor that stood out the most as a sign of immobility was family structure. Areas with a high percentage of children living only with their mother tend to have worse future income prospects for those children. And incredibly, when research is statistically controlled for the fraction of single-parent households in a region, other correlations like racial composition and even income inequality practically lost their significance. In other words, what I mean is that the massive presence of fatherless families can create disadvantageous effects that take away opportunities from future generations, leaving no room for arguments about race or low education. This finding was so strong that the authors concluded that family structure measures, such as the fraction of single parents, are the most robust indicators of an area's economic upward mobility. These results prove an absolute truth. Communities where fatherhood is weakened tend to lack support networks and have fewer examples of success that help encourage young people to move up in life. And the proportion of children growing up without a father present varies enormously around the world. And these differences are a natural laboratory for us to look at the possible impacts of this. Research from the Peel Research Center, covering 130 countries, revealed that the United States has the highest rate of single parenthood in the developed world, with about 23% of children living with only one parent, usually the mother. This rate is more than 3 times the global average, which is only 7%, but societies known for traditional family values show much lower percentages. In China, only 3% of children live in single-parent households, in India 5% and in Nigeria 4%. And even Western countries like Canada, which has 15%, and Western Europe, around 10% to 15%, are below the American level. This difference suggests different historical trajectories, while some Western nations like the United States and the United Kingdom are experiencing massive family breakdown, while other cultures have maintained until recently more traditional arrangements with a strong paternal presence. East Asian nations like Japan and South Korea have historically valued the intact family structure. Until recently, rates of births outside marriage were lower than 2% or 3%, and it's no wonder that these countries have such low levels of juvenile delinquency and violence when compared to Western countries with similar income levels. Japan specifically has had one of the lowest violent crime rates in the world for decades. And scholars often attribute part of this to the family and community cohesion rooted in that culture. Similarly, countries with a strong religious and family tradition, such as some societies in the Middle East and South Asia, show, on average, higher levels of filial obedience, stronger parental support, and a lower incidence of violent behavior among young people, even if their economic level is much lower than that of the average American family. In Brazil, the family structure presented by the 2022 IBGE census showed the evolution of family configurations in Brazil. The proportion of women without a spouse and with children went from 11.6% in 2000 to 13.5% in 2022, reaching about 7.8 million families of this kind. This change reflects a reduction in families formed by couples with children from 56.4% to 42% in the same period. The data from the National Association of Civil Registry Officers shows that thousands of children are registered without the father's name on their documents. And scientific research on family structure and child development in Brazil shows the relationship between family structure, including the absence of the father and several other scenarios, and child development. A study on detained adolescents in São Paulo found that the presence of the father was rare or non-existent in about 30% of young offenders, and that caregivers, including the father when present, have a protective effect. Studies by IPA and the Brazilian Public Security Forum show that young males involved in violent crimes mostly come from homes without a present father or with a highly unstable father figure. And regardless of the mother's income and education, the effects are the same. One of the most serious effects in Brazil is the impact on boys. Research in social psychology and criminology points to deficits in self-control, greater impulsiveness, and greater exposure to high-risk groups in environments where the father figure is absent or replaced by equally unstable peers. And here in Brazil, since the 1990s, left-wing parties and academic movements associated with the left have created a specific Brazilian cultural factor, which is the social normalization of the absent father. The dominant discourse often romanticizes the heroic mother, while at the same time removing responsibility from the man or even criminalizing the father figure, creating a perverse balance, where the social cost falls on the child, society, and the government. In other words, there is pressure for everyone to have a strong presence in making decisions about the child's future, but the father figure is pushed away. In Brazil, the absence of the father is not just a social problem, it is a structural factor of underdevelopment with a direct impact on public safety, productivity, and civilizational stability. Alright everyone, this video is not an attack against single mothers or, in fewer cases, single fathers under any circumstances. It's a double warning. First, that this explains part of the global chaos we're seeing, where the most basic and core part of civilizations, of societies, is the family. And it's been like this for thousands and thousands of years, and now we're seeing in recent decades this attack, and of course there were going to be consequences. And the second warning is to show how it's not easy to be from a single parent family, to only have the father or to be the mother. But again, it's not inevitable that you will have troubled children or something like that. It's not inevitable, but it's a statistical chance. After all, it doesn't just depend a lot on the personality of the father and the mother, but also on the broader family context. A lot of people, a lot of mothers are single, not because they want to be, but because things happened and led to that, and that's just how the world is, unfortunately. Not everything is based on our decisions. I wish we could decide everything, but that's not how it is. But again, it's not inevitable that you'll see single-parent families having problems with their children, and I'm an example of that. I'm the son of a single mother, and if you think it's really hard to raise kids as a single mother nowadays, you have no idea what a living hell it was in the 90s. Society was much more hostile, much more intolerant towards single mothers back then, and here I am. I used to hear it a lot, even from relatives, from teachers, that I was headed for juvenile detention, that I would end up in jail when I grew up because I was trouble, I was rebellious, I would become a bank robber or maybe a drug dealer. And well, here I am at 40 years old and none of that ever happened. On the contrary, my educational level was even higher than the rest of my family. I'm the only one with a master's and doctorate, for example. So it's a statistical example that it's possible, even though it's very difficult, to overcome these challenges. But of course, it will still depend a lot on the context that this single mother or single father is in. Okay? So if you find yourself in this situation, don't get discouraged. Just keep in mind that you'll have to give even more of yourself to raise this child. And ideally, of course, if you have a traditional family with a father and a mother, keep it that way. Today, you are part of a resistance force because there are attacks from the government, attacks from the media, attacks from academia all the time against this traditional family. After all, it's toxic fatherhood, right? Fight against this by maintaining this tradition, okay? This is a very strong form of resistance, and don't doubt that you will reap positive results. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Share this video. If you really like the Geopolitica Mundial channel, consider becoming a member. Not only do you make sure the channel keeps existing, but you also get access to exclusive content. There are several exclusive videos, right? We have the history of India, the geopolitical history of the United States, the military history of China, an intelligence course. Check it out. So you'll get access to this content, and your name, depending on the category, will appear here at the end as a thank you, alright? Thank you everyone, take care, and see you in the next video.